Muslims by Ali Mahmood. Episode 6. Bursa is a pretty seaside town in Turkey that rises up the mountain slope to 2 graves and a giant 600-year-old tree. This town was the original home of the Osmanli family, and the graves hold the bodies of Osman and his son Orhan, the founders of the Ottoman Dynasty that ruled Asia and Europe for 6.5 centuries. Orhan expanded the small kingdom of his father by war, purchase and marriage. He liked Byzantine princesses and married 3. The Byzantine emperors were happy to reinforce their declining power by an alliance with the rough Turkish warrior chief who lived simply, ate with his men, and followed a strange new habit of accumulating money. Murad I was a conqueror who expanded his empire but was assassinated by a Serb. His son Bayezid, later called the Thunderbolt, immediately executed his brother and took the crown. Bayezid was short-tempered, headstrong and arrogant. He saw himself as a man of destiny. "I was born to bear arms and to conquer whatever is before me." He inherited 101,000 square miles from his father Murad, and by 1402 had increased it by conquest to 267,000 square miles. And then his army met Timur at Ankara, and it was all over. His valiant but futile resistance was, in the words of the historian Arabshah, like a man who sweeps away dust with a comb or drains the sea with a sieve. Bayezid died in captivity, and the shattered empire fell into civil war as his heirs fought for control. The capable Murad II consolidated and restored the empire. 2 of his 3 sons died, leaving the 3rd, Mehmet, who was prepared for rule. Mehmet was an unruly boy who refused to study. After a serious beating by his tutor, Mehmet became a model student, highly educated and fluent in 6 languages. Mehmet used 3 innovations to build his empire. The law of fratricide. Mehmet ordered, "Whichever of my sons inherits the throne, it behooves him to kill his brothers in the interests of world order." The Janissaries, a professional standing army of converted Christian slaves whose exclusive occupation was the art of war. Not allowed to marry, they lived, fought, and died for their sultan. The Devshimi, or annual harvest of Christian boys who were converted, educated, and trained to lead. Their recognition, reward, and promotion were determined solely by merit and performance. Mehmet's overriding ambition was to conquer Constantinople, which he did 2 years after becoming sultan. Constantinople had for centuries defied conquest, protected by its massive walls and by a great chain that prevented ships from attacking by sea. Mehmet built a special road on which he moved his ships overland on oiled timbers, circumventing the protective chain and surprising the defenders by suddenly appearing behind them. Mehmet built the palace of Topkapi, the seat of power for his family for 300 years, and also the Grand Bazaar, which became the greatest center of commerce in the world. Within a century, Istanbul was recognized as the greatest city in the world. Over a 30-year rule, he conquered Serbia, Bosnia, Albania, much of Greece, and finally Hungary. He also subdued Venice and invaded Italy. Europe trembled at his name. He survived 14 assassination attempts and, sick from excessive eating and drinking, died at the age of 49 in 1481. The next sultan, Bayezid, had 8 sons, 5 of whom died. Salim survived and marched on his father, persuading him to step down in his favor. Within a year of taking the throne, Selim defeated and killed his 2 surviving brothers, executed 6 of his nephews and 3 of his own sons, leaving the way clear for his last surviving son, Suleiman. Selim was a taciturn man who kept his thoughts to himself, ate alone, and governed alone. He is remembered in history as Selim the Grim. Like his grandfather Mehmet, Selim was a great conqueror, but with his focus more on the rival Islamic kingdoms than on Christian Europe. He defeated the Persian king Shah Ismail and then the Mamluks of Egypt, the other great Muslim kingdom of the time, who controlled the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. He brought back from Cairo the holy relics from the time of the Prophet and furthermore brought back the Caliph himself, who was living as a puppet in Cairo. In Istanbul, the Caliph resigned his position in favor of Selim, who thus became the first Ottoman Caliph. The Ottomans, who were not even Arabs, let alone from the family of the Prophet, held the caliphate till it was terminated once and for all by Ataturk in the 20th century. Selim ruled for only 8 years, but in that short time he doubled the extent of his empire. He inspired fear. Failure to perform was punished by death. In his short reign, 7 of his grand viziers were executed. When he died, Europe breathed a sigh of relief. It was said, "A gentle lamb has succeeded a fierce lion, for Suleiman is young without experience." How wrong they were. Suleiman was the 10th and last of the great Ottoman sultans. He took the empire to its peak, but also sowed the seeds of its decline. A great statesman and conqueror, he was known in Europe as Suleiman the Magnificent, and among the Turks as Suleiman the Lawgiver. He was the greatest and most powerful ruler of his time. The young Suleiman wanted peace, but the Janissaries wanted war. With no families and no other professions, peace left them bored with empty pockets. They mutinied in an orgy of killing, breaking into the palace where Suleiman himself killed 3 of them before retiring to safety. After that, Suleiman never made the same mistake again and himself led 13 campaigns, keeping his Janissaries happy and loyal. With no family, Suleiman grew up with slaves. His mother had started life as a slave, as had his wife, Hurrem. Even Ibrahim the Greek, his friend, brother-in-law, and powerful vizier, for 13 years was a slave. Ibrahim accumulated great wealth and lived in splendor that equaled his master, but all this power and status went to his head. Jealous enemies prayed for his destruction, and most important of all, his backing of the crown prince, Mustafa, had turned the empress, who wanted the crown for her own son Selim, into his enemy. Ibrahim was invited for dinner by the Sultan. The next morning, his body was found. No questions were asked, no answers were given. Hurrem entered the harem as a slave girl. She was ambitious and skilled in the arts of manipulation and conspiracy. Her first victim was the senior consort, Gulbahar, the mother of the crown prince, Mustafa. She then conspired against the Grand Vizier, Ibrahim, who was murdered. Her final success was in manipulating her husband to murder his son, Mustafa, the crown prince, loved by both the people and the Janissaries. Mustafa was warned not to obey his father's summons, but he went, saying that if he had to die, it could not be in a better way than by his father's hand. He was murdered by 3 deaf mutes, and his body was displayed on a carpet for all to see. By eliminating Mustafa, she saved the life of her favorite son, Selim, who went on to become sultan after the death of Suleiman. In the power struggle between Charles, the Holy Roman Emperor, and Suleiman the Magnificent, Khair al-Din Barbarossa, the pirate, tipped the scales. The greatest seaman of his time, he was appointed admiral of the Ottoman fleet. The two Barbarossa brothers, Aruj and Kar al-Din, dominated the Mediterranean. They regularly defeated the European fleets, ensuring the supremacy of their master Suleiman. In July 1546, Kar al-Din Barbarossa died of a fever. He had founded the Kingdom of Algeria and had trained his great lieutenant and successor, Dragut, who became Sultan of Tripoli. The official Turkish history recorded, "The King of the Sea is dead." The factors that led to the rise of the Ottomans under Suleiman were the conquests of his father, Selim the Grim, Selim's elimination of his son's rivals, Suleiman's capability and excellent choice of lieutenants, the superior quality of generals and administrators created by the system of merit and palace education of slave boys. The emphasis on justice. Suleiman was known as Kanuni. Low taxation but rich treasuries financed by war. But Suleiman's flaws also contributed to the decline that followed his rule. He started the lateral entry of favorites into the top ranks of power. He allowed his grand viziers to sell offices in the administration and to amass great fortunes. He allowed the influence of the harem to grow. His wife Hurrem boasted, "I live with the Sultan and make him do what I wish." This led to the rule of the favored women who conspired to place incompetent and debauched sons on the throne. He killed his able sons Mustafa and Bayezid and passed succession to the fat, incompetent drunkard Selim the Sot. Suleiman married Selim's daughters to his two most important and trustworthy deputies, Sokollu and Piali, to ensure capable government in the event of his death. He then set out on a new war. He was 72 years old and, like Tamerlane, died on the road. After Suleiman, incompetent and degenerate sultans were not able to control the lawlessness of the Janissaries, the fanaticism of the mullahs, the corruption of the pashas, the greed and conspiracies of the harem, and the rising strength of the Europeans. Most important of all the changes that weakened the empire was the replacement of the law of fratricide that had ensured the survival of the fittest by the institution of the cage, the royal prison that produced a series of mad and incompetent sultans totally unfit to rule. The cage was introduced by a sultan who did not want to kill his brother, but good intentions led to disastrous and cruel results. Over 300 years, the 10 great sultans had taken the Ottoman Empire to the leadership of the world. Over the next 300 years, 15 incompetent, degenerate, and often insane sultans oversaw the dramatic decline of the empire. The enlightened administrations of the three grand viziers, Ibrahim, Rustam, and Sokollu, whose loyalties had been secured by marriage to the sister, daughter, and granddaughter of Suleiman, was followed by the conspiracies of the rule of the favored women, which lasted for 100 years under Nurbano, Salim's wife, Safaye, the Venetian consort of Murad III and mother of Mehmed III, and Kosum, the daughter of a Greek priest who married Sultan Ahmed I and was Sultana Valida during the rule of her sons Murad IV and Ibrahim and her grandson Mehmed IV. Selim, the son of Suleiman, was a sweet-natured drunk who left affairs of state to his son-in-law Sokollu as he concentrated on fun, games, and alcohol. The only time he overrode Sokollu's policies was when he invaded Cyprus to make his Jewish bootlegger Nasi king of Cyprus. Finally, after downing a bottle of his favorite Cyprus wine, he slipped in the bath, cracked his skull, and died. Nurbano, Salim's wife, was jealous of the power of the Grand Vizier Sokollu. She convinced her son, the Sultan, that Sokollu was fabulously rich through corruption and had Sokollu assassinated. But when the Sultan went after the secret fortune, he discovered that there was none. Sokollu had always been an honest man and died relatively poor. Safaye was powerful as the consort of Sultan Murad and then all-powerful as the Sultana Valida after his death. On becoming Sultan, Murad executed his 5 small brothers. His only memorable achievement was to father 103 children. Her first act as Sultana Valida was to persuade her son, Mehmed, to murder his 19 brothers, who were lined up, circumcised, and killed. The Sultan wept, buried his brothers with due decorum, and went on with his idle life. The last of the favoured women was Qasim, 2 of whose sons became Sultan in turn, Murad IV, who was a homicidal maniac, and Ibrahim, a sex-crazy lunatic. Murad IV was a big, strong man who could outfight, outshoot, and outride any of his subjects. He ruled through fear, and in 1637 alone, he executed 25,000 of his subjects. By this time, the sultans had become non-entities, dragged from long periods of imprisonment in the cage, sometimes even 50 years. These sultans were broken men when they ascended the throne. Government was in shambles. The empire was collapsing while Europe was rising. Now, a family rose from obscurity to restore the Ottoman Empire, the Koprolus, father, son and brother, who in turn ruled as Grand Viziers of powerless sultans for 50 years. Muhammad Koprolu was an Albanian who started his career as kitchen boy in the palace. At the age of 70, he was appointed Grand Vizier. His appointment was severely criticized by the court nobles, who argued that he was senile and could not read or write. The critics were very wrong. In his 5 years in office, he executed 35,000 offenders in a rampage of justice that cleaned up the empire. Merit replaced the mafia of plunder that had grown rampant. He had no love of wealth and lived simply. His son, Ahmed, was equally efficient and successful. After the death of Ahmed, Kara Black Mustafa, the son-in-law of the Sultan, became vizier. It was a bad choice. Kara Mustafa was bloodthirsty, greedy, and corrupt. He led the second siege of Vienna, which was an unmitigated disaster. The Turks were better trained, better equipped, and their 275,000-man army outnumbered the 35,000 soldiers who defended Vienna. It was impossible for them to lose. Kara Mustafa's concern, however, was not to win a victory that he saw as inevitable. It was to maximize his personal gain from the victory. According to the Ottoman traditions of war, the army received the greatest share of the spoils if victory was won in battle, but the commander received the greatest share if victory was won by a siege. So Kara Mustafa ordered a siege, but the time wasted allowed an army to come to the rescue. The Turks were defeated and Kara Mustafa was executed. Austria destroyed forever the hegemony of Ottoman military power. With the end of the favoured women, the mad sultans and the Koprolu viziers, a new influence rose in court, Amy de Bouc de Rivory. Amy was a convent girl from Martinique who was captured by pirates and gifted to the Sultan. She was the cousin of Josephine, the wife of Napoleon. Her son was Mahmoud the Reformer, and her grandson, Abdul Majid, built the gigantic Dolmabas Palace for an amount equivalent to $1.5 billion today. Under Mahmoud the Reformer, the administration, army and palace were modernized and westernized. The Janissaries had mutinied and almost killed Mahmoud, who was saved by hiding under a pile of carpets. Now he slaughtered the Janissaries to the last man. More than 10,000 were killed, and this strange force, whose conquests had secured the empire and then, degenerate and uncontrollable, had become its greatest threat, was eliminated once and for all. The massacre of the Janissaries is known in Turkish history as the auspicious event. Abdul Hameed and his brother Abdul Aziz were big spenders, and they depleted the treasury and reduced the Ottomans to the sick man of Europe. In 1838, the Egyptian modernizer Muhammad Ali Pasha declared Egypt independent and marched his army on Istanbul, but the five great powers, England, Russia, France, Austria and Prussia, checkmated each other in a balance of power that protected and secured the interest of Turkey. The second of the four sons of Abdul Hameed to become Sultan was Abdul Hameed II, who ruled for 33 years and was known as the Red Sultan. He is considered the greatest Sultan after Suleiman the Magnificent. He was a poet, a wrestler, and an avid fan of Sherlock Holmes detective novels. A contorted political genius and a statesman par excellence, he was totally eccentric. He inherited a crumbling empire and was constantly under attack by the outstanding politician Midhat Pasha, who was determined to impose constitutional rule on the Sultan. Abdul Hameed had Midhat convicted of the murder of the late Sultan Abdul Aziz and was banished to Taif in Saudi Arabia, where he was assassinated. Abdul Hameed was approached by Theodore Herzl for land to form a state for the Jews. When offered £150 million sterling, he replied, "Even if you gave me as much gold as the entire world, I would never accept what you ask of me." Abdul Hameed was a pan-Islamist who was opposed by the Young Turks triumvirate Enver, Talat and Jamal. In 1908, he ordered a general election in which the CUP, the party of the Young Turks, won all but one of the 288 seats in parliament. The army took control, stormed Yildiz Palace and arrested the Sultan, who was deported. The Young Turks triumvirate was soon to become the villains of tomorrow when they joined the Germans, the losing side in the First World War. The rising soldier named Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, the father of the Turks. Ataturk was considered one of the greatest soldiers of his time. He was the only general never to lose a battle. He defeated the Australians, the New Zealanders and British at Gallipoli and the Greeks at Smyrna. He was a nationalist without equal, dedicated to saving his country by withdrawing from empire and creating the new nation of Turkey. Defeat at Gallipoli led to the demotion of Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, the termination of the military career of Sir Ian Hamilton, the British commander of the Middle East forces, and played a part in the collapse of the Asquith government. Years later, Lloyd George, the UK Prime Minister, was to say of Ataturk, "The centuries rarely produce a genius. It was our bad luck that the greatest genius of our era was granted to the Turkish nation." Ataturk resigned from the army and decisively won the election. In the 3 years between 1919 and 1922, Ataturk drove out the Sultan, abolished the Caliphate, fought and won the war against the Greeks, negotiated the Treaty of Lausanne, established expanded frontiers for the new state of Turkey, wrote a new constitution, created a parliament, created the new capital of Ankara. But all this was a preamble to his achievements in power as a secular nationalist ruler, modernization of his country, emancipation of women and the right to vote, westernization of dress and culture, replacement of the traditional Arabic script by a new Latin script, introduction of modern scientific education in place of the madrasa system, building of a new infrastructure of roads, bridges, schools and hospitals, replacement of the traditional judicial system with a new secular system, replacement of the religious elite with a modern bureaucracy, the creation of a new opposition party to dilute the monopoly of power of his ruling party. Roosevelt, the American president, described Ataturk as the most interesting leader in the world. He closed forever the Ottoman centuries and created the new nation of Turkey, whose name he took for himself.